So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's event organized by the Department of Economics and the Müller-Möll Foundation. Special welcome to members of the Cantonal Parliament and a member of the Finance Committee, Ralf Margreiter. I also welcome members of the Executive Board of the University of Zurich, Stefan Schnieder, members of the University Board, Barbara Basting and Antonio Loprieno, members of the National Parliament, Kati Ricklin, my colleague, the Department Chair, Rainer Winkelmann, and special welcome, of course, to Carolina and to our special guest, Dick Thaler. It's an honor to me to welcome you all here. At the beginning, that's a routine statement. We will film the lecture, so if you don't want to be on the film, you have to move to the side. But the experience tells us that most people don't object to that. Now let me introduce Dick Thaler. He is Professor of Behavioral Science and Economics at the University of Chicago School of Business, and he is current President of the American Economic Association. If somebody would have asked Dick in 1980 whether he will once be President of the American Economic Association, he probably would have told you belong into psychiatry, but not into a reasonable predictive science. But what this shows, the fact that he is current president of the American Economic Association, shows the ultimate success of behavioral economics in the profession. Now, I studied economics in the 1970s. I'm a bit younger than Dick. And from the viewpoint of what I learned in the 1970s, behavioral economics constitutes a revolution, basically. Instead of assuming unlimited rationality, behavioral economists have shown that people are bounded irrational in very specific ways. Instead of assuming unlimited willpower, there is now strong evidence indicating that we have all our weaknesses, and have limited willpower, and we also know now that people have bounded self-interest. They are not the self-interested agent that populates typical economic models from the 1970s. In my view, Dick was probably the single most important person in turning behavioral economics into a success enterprise. To make this happen, you had to fight many battles. And once, when I was a young scientist, and asked him, how did you succeed? How did you manage to get published in these important journals that built the reputation? And he said, every paper was a battle. And when you know Dick, actually, maybe he has also succeeded because he likes to battle. And probably he has lost some of them. He didn't always get his papers into the journal in which he wanted to get them, but he has won the overall battle, basically, which is the success of behavioral economics, the penetration of the discipline, the reshaping of the discipline along the lines of behavioral economics. He not only won because he had truth on his side. That's, of course, important in science. But you also have to have other personal characteristics in order to win and to be influential. And I actually think you like to provoke. So it's fun for you to provoke, and you have to have the personal characteristics that make it possible for you to go against the opposition of everybody initially, of almost everybody. And in this context, you applied an early behavioral strategy, which I call the strategy of limited provocation. Now, you can also see his success is not only visible because he's current president of the American Economic Association. He has, if you look at Google Scholar, he has 85,000 Google Scholar sites. Enormous. 8,000 at least every year are added to that. He has numerous academic and public best-selling books. Many of you know his two more recent books. One is about Nudge, which is a huge success, not just in terms of copies sold, but also in terms of the practical implication. The British government has now a Nudge unit. The German government is following. The Austrian government is following. Perhaps the Swiss government will also follow. We tend to look first whether something becomes successful before we go after the things. But then once we move properly. And of course, his latest book about which he's talking today, which is Misbehaving. I'm happy to have him here, that we could entice him to come to Europe to talk about this book. I'm sure we are all looking forward to an interesting and exciting lecture. But before Dick has his word, I want to welcome Caroline Müller-Möhl, who also wants to say a few words. She's the co-host and the co-organizer, together with the Department of Economics, of this lecture. And for those who don't know her, I believe most people know her. She is a Swiss investor and philanthropist, founder and president of the Müller-Möhl Group and Müller-Möhl Foundation. And she has many mandates in many boards. I can't talk about all this, but she will tell you now what she has to say. Carolina, please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I will of course not talk to you about my mandates, but I'm going to welcome you to the second event that the Müller-Möhl Foundation and the Department of Economics are organizing together. Last time we invited the German philosopher Richard David Precht, and we discussed about the future of education. Tonight we have the honor to listen to another Richard, Professor Richard Thaler, although I heard your name is Dick. Is that right? Richard is fine, okay. So, Richard, I'm very much looking forward to listen to your explanation why we are all idiots when it comes to money, as a journalist recently puts it, and why there is very little we can do about it. Professor Thaler looks at human behavior in its entirety. This enables us to better understand why, in the contrast of the predictions of mainstream economic theory, people do not always act in their own self-interest. In an interview in the recent Sunday edition of the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Professor Thaler said that he always signs his book with, I find, fantastic words, which are, keep notching for good. As a philanthropist who hopes to inspire others and follow suit and engage for general good, I will for sure endorse and act upon your recommendation. Philanthropy and behavioral economics have a lot in common. Modern philanthropy wants to make a significant contribution to societal development. So does behavioral economics. They both offer very specific solutions in order to make the world a better place. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein published their bestseller book, Nudge, as Ernst just mentioned. Nudging describes a method whereby people's incentive structure is softly altered, thus making the right choice more attractive. Through sometimes very simple tricks, decision-making of groups and individuals can be influenced. In other words, nudges can alter people's behavior without limiting their freedom of choice. I'm convinced that this is, in many cases, more effective than direct instructions, legislation, and enforcement. In two of the topics of my foundation, early childhood education and the compatibility of work and family life, nudging, I am very convinced, could help to improve the situation in Switzerland. As a foundation, we are benefiting from the knowledge and insights that behavioral economics has generated in the past. And we are a firm supporter of research and development. It is absolutely crucial to our foundation's work. Only as experts of our topics we can really make a difference. The Department of Economics is certainly one of our closest allies. The outstanding work of Ernst and his colleagues is always a source of inspiration to us, and we value very much our close relationship. Before now, we have the pleasure to hear more about misbehaving. I have to tell you, I did so already today. I enjoyed, for example, a big luncheon, although I knew there will be big dinner served tonight. And as if there was not enough misbehaving for the day, I also cancelled my morning workout, although I knew sports is a good thing on a day and a night like tonight. And last but not least, my foundation is supporting this event without any assurance that the foundation is benefiting from. Joking aside, dear Richard Thaler, it's a great pleasure to listen to you tonight, and I'm sure you're going to enlighten us immediately. The floor is yours.
Wow. Thanks for those very generous introductions. And it's great to be here. And it's always great to see Ernst, who we were talking before, I first met in 1994 at the first in a series of summer camps that a group of us organized to help, I sometimes say, corrupt young economists. But Ernst had already been corrupted, and so we were happy to welcome him on that occasion, and we've been friends ever since. So, yeah, the title, I don't know who thought of the title that was given, but it's fine as far as I'm concerned if you think you're clever. What I'm going to talk about tonight is why it took so long. As Ernst was saying, I started thinking about misbehaving when I was a graduate student in the 1970s. So it's been a long road. So first, let's say, what is behavioral economics? And here's a definition from Herb Simon, who was himself a predecessor of behavioral economics. And he uses a word here that you shouldn't be embarrassed if you don't know what it means. Pleonasm. It means a redundant phrase. And as he correctly points out, one could ask, what other kind of economics could there be? And then he answers his question. The answer to that puzzle is that there is another kind of economics that isn't about behavior. It's about a series of assumptions about behavior, and those assumptions are not realistic. Thus, the need for some other kind of economics that is about behavior. So, what are those assumptions? The core assumption of economics is about maximization. In virtually any economic theory, you will see the operator max in front of some equation. And the idea is that people are choosing the best alternative possible given their income and wealth constraints. So of all the things you could be doing with this evening, if you're satisfying economic theory, you've picked the best one. Now, it helps that it's free. So, but, you know, there are other things you could be doing. So the question is that accurate? Do we systematically pick the best things that we could do. So I like to refer to the creatures that standard economists study as econs. That's short for Homo economicus. And they're kind of like Spock here. And instead, the rest of us are more like this guy. Now, that's actually the best thing I've got, so I'm going to let that linger a little. What's the difference between econs and humans? Well, Ernst really already mentioned that. Econs are perfect calculators. They can look at a series of mortgages and pick the one that's best for them. They have perfect expectations about the future. They already know what the Fed is going to announce in a few hours. They have no self-control problems, so they would never have a big lunch the day before a big dinner, much less skip the exercise class before the lunch. And they're complete jerks. If someone finds a wallet left behind, then they will take the money there and then throw the wallet away. So, assuming they can't be caught. So, what about humans? Humans are dumber, weaker-willed, and nicer. And in fact, one of Ernst's students, who's now my postdoc, has done a study of lost wallets. And in fact, many people return lost wallets, and the more money that's in the wallet, the more they return. So it's good that people are nicer than economists give them credit for. It's not so good that we have self-control problems, and it would be great to be as smart as economists give us credit for, but unfortunately that's not the case. So what can we do? We need to modify economics to include these real people that we work with and live with every day. So here's an early example of human nature that I discovered when I was living in Ithaca, New York, teaching at Cornell University. I don't know how, this isn't the best picture. If my wife had taken it, it would have been better. But you see this box here? So notice it has a lock. Now, the setup is there's a farmer who has put some, in this case, rhubarb, out on the table, and the price is $1.50. This picture was taken a long time ago, so it's probably up to $3. And the expectation is that people will put money in the box if they take the rhubarb. Now, in economic theory, this doesn't exist. Because the first guy who comes will take all the rhubarb and leave no money. And the farmer knows, since farmers have rational expectations, the farmer knows that the first guy would do that, so he doesn't put all the money that went into the construction of this spiffy stand and doesn't bother to put out any rhubarb. But I think these farmers actually have about the right model of human nature. So, which gives us to the lock. If the box was open, there are enough econs out there that somebody would come by and take the money. But if the box is locked, then enough people will pay to make it worthwhile for the farmer to put the produce out there. So that's the kind of model of human nature that we need, and that's what behavioral economics is all about. It's about studying real people. So let me tell you a story about my early teaching career. This was at Cornell, and I was teaching microeconomics, the basic economics class. And I gave an exam, and I wanted the exam to be hard. I wanted to discriminate between the star students and the average students and the ones who totally didn't get it. So I wanted a big spread. And so I succeeded in that. And the average score on this exam was 72 out of 100. And the students were furious with me. So, you know, I was teaching at an Ivy League university, and the students are used to getting good grades, and 72 is not a good grade. And I was a young professor hoping to get tenure, and provoking students was not part of my agenda. So what to do? I didn't want to make my exam any easier. So the next exam, I made out of 137 points. Now, this exam turned out to be a little harder. The average score was 70%, but if you do the math, that means the average grade was 96, which is great. I mean, 96 is just a really good score. There's no doubt about it. So, problem solved. So, 137 was not a number picked at random. It was picked because it was high enough that the average score would be a good number. Some people even got over 100, which created something like ecstasy. And it's also a little hard to divide by 137. And so most students didn't bother, and so they just were happy. Now, notice I had somehow written a harder exam and made the students happier, and this is complete misbehaving, and I was hooked. So, this exam illustrates one of the concepts I introduce in my new book, Misbehaving, which is what I call supposedly irrelevant factors, or SIFs. So, what is a SIF? There are many things that economists, well, I should say there are many things economists disagree about. So, you can find many who have strong opinions that the Fed should raise interest rates today, and others with equally strong opinions that it shouldn't, and they will never agree. What can you get economists to agree on? A long list of things that shouldn't matter. So these are things that will not alter behavior. So for example, the number of points on an exam will not affect how happy the students are after they take it, right? That's an irrelevant factor. So there's a long list of these. Social norms. Econs don't care about social norms. They do the thing that makes them happiest. And if it goes against the social norm, the hell with the social norm. They don't care about framing, meaning the way a problem is phrased. But research by my mentors, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, I know Danny was here recently, maybe some of you heard him talk, they gave did some early experiments where they showed that people behave differently if you describe the results of some medical procedure in terms of survival probabilities versus mortality probabilities. And that was true even of physicians. So you tell the physician, here's some procedure, and it has a 90% chance of survival. They do one thing. If you say 10% chance of death, they do something else. Right? That's misbehaving. Defaults. What happens if... The default is, what happens if you do nothing? Now, if the costs of action are low, then the setting of a default shouldn't matter. But we've all had the experience of finding ourselves watching some mindless television show only because it happened to follow some show that we turned on intentionally. And it's just on the same channel, and it's there, and we're watching it. Now, right, the cost of switching is one thumb click, right? That's as close to zero transaction costs as we can get in a practical model, and yet all of us have had that experience of sticking with the status quo. So now, look, we can mention these, and everybody will nod and say, of course, you're right. But as Ernst suggested, economists were not prepared to just listen to common sense. They had a long list of excuses why we didn't have to pay attention to things like this. One of the most powerful put-downs had just two words: as if. Now, this put-down was coined by Milton Friedman, the great Chicago economist. And what he said was, we shouldn't judge a theory by the realism of its assumptions, but rather by the validity of its predictions. That's actually fine. But then the question is, how good are the predictions? So here's an example. This goes with the title of the lecture, How Clever Are You? In the US, what's the ratio of gun deaths by homicide to gun deaths by suicide? So you can think of what your answer is. Most people think gun deaths are more common, maybe by 2 or 3 to 1. Actually, there are twice as many gun deaths by suicide. So if you think we have a terrible gun problem in the US, and you're right, it's even worse than you thought, because the ones you read about are the homicides, and there are twice as many people dying by suicide. In fact, I often remark to audiences that if you buy a gun thinking you're protecting your family, that you're just increasing the chance someone in your family will commit suicide. But what's the point? The point is, this is a predictable error, right? So people are not acting as if they were maximizing, or as if, in this case, they had rational expectations. And it's a predictable error. If we had taken a poll, you would have, on average, got this question wrong. And I can predict that you'll get it wrong. And there are hundreds more that we could do. So here are two other comments I would often get, sometimes from the same person. One is, well, you know, you've run some experiment, and the stakes you're using are pretty small. If you raise the stakes, people will get it right. I would also hear, well, you've run some experiment, and this is the first time the subjects saw this task. In the real world, we learn. Okay? Now, both of these seem like reasonable observations, certainly good questions to ask. But one thing to note is that these two comments are contradictory. And the reason is that the things that we do most often, which are the things we get to learn about, are the things that are of the lowest stakes. So I have a list here. I call this list the Bin-More Continuum, named after a famous economist who provoked me by making these two claims in a little debate we were having. And so I wrote on the blackboard this list of things we buy. And notice the frequency with which we buy them goes down as the stakes go up. Right? So buying milk, most of us are pretty good at that. We know whether to buy 1 liter or 2 liters when we go to the grocery store. And if we buy too big a container, it spoils before we use it. If too small, we have to go back. You know, that you do maybe twice a week. You know, within a few years, you can nail that one. Right? Suits, you know, for academics like me, you know, every 5 years is plenty. Houses, you know, maybe every decade or two. Marriages, 2, 3 is usually enough. And retirement, barring reincarnation, we get to save for retirement once. So as the stakes go up, our opportunities for learning and our chance to practice goes down. So in fact, for the biggest stake stuff, there's very little chance to learn. And so we better be able to get it right the first time. And the evidence is people aren't very good at doing it the first time. I could have put, instead of house, choosing a mortgage, and we know how good people were at that. We also know how good people were at lending those mortgages and buying securities, and I won't rub salt into any wounds. Here's another line I used to hear a lot. Well, okay, maybe they can't solve these problems themselves, but if the stakes matter, they'll hire an expert. So if it really mattered to know the gun death question, you'd hire an expert, namely Google, and you'd find out. But you know, what about choosing mortgages, houses, marriages? It's very hard to find somebody that's unbiased. And mostly people don't do it. How many people choose a consultant to help them pick a spouse? Maybe more should. Certainly those people who chose mortgages with the aid of a mortgage broker in 2005 and 2006 in hot mortgage markets were not aided by that mortgage broker who was being paid $5,000 for each mortgage that he wrote. So the bottom line is there's no evidence to support the claim that decisions get better at higher stakes. And so we better suck it up and learn how real people make decisions, both for low stakes and for high stakes. Here's an example of one way of raising the stakes. There's a game show. I've now written 3 papers about game shows, just to see how low I've sunk. And I will say I haven't watched many episodes of these shows, but that's what research assistants are for. Fortunately, you don't have to get approval to have your research assistant watch game shows and write down what happens, although it may not pass the Geneva Conventions. But anyway, this particular game show, there are some entertaining episodes you can find on the web, ends with the most famous game of all, Prisoner's Dilemma. And in particular, in this show, at the end, there are two players left. They have some money, as much as £100,000 in one show. And they each have a decision to make. In the show, it's split or steal. In the normal game theory, it's cooperate or defect. And if they both split, they share the prize. If one says split and one says steal, the one who says steal gets all the money. And if they both say steal, they both get nothing. Well, what do people do in this game? First of all, why do this? Ernst, have you managed to get somebody to fund a study that costs £2.8 million? You know, talk to your philanthropist friend, but normally that's outside the budget that we academics have to run an experiment. So there have been thousands of experiments using the prisoner's dilemma for smaller stakes. And what happens in these experiments at low stakes is about 40 to 50% cooperate. Now, what happens if you raise the stakes? Now, many economists, including some behavioral economists like Matthew Rabin, predicted that cooperation would fall as the stakes go up. So we could test that hypothesis for very high stakes. So does cooperation go up as the stakes go up? Go down as the stakes go up? Sort of. So here's the data. So if we have stakes going from low to high on the right, and you can see the curve does slope down. So yes, cooperation rates fall as the stakes go up, but they fall to the rates we normally observe in the lab, 40 to 50% for £10,000. That's a lot of money. The only reason it slopes down is when the stakes are very low for the context of this show, cooperation rates are really high. So if people are only playing for £100, which is $170, I don't know what it is in Swiss francs, now that would be a big stakes experiment in a lab. And but here, they cooperate 70% of the time. And it's what my co-authors and I call the big peanuts phenomena. And we observed this in another game show we studied, which is when people are playing for stakes that in another context would be considered large, but in this context are considered small, they say, you know, it's peanuts. So, you know, here you're playing a prisoner's dilemma on national television. If it's for just £100, why look like a jerk? But if it's £10,000, then we get cooperation rates just the same as we do in the lab. Okay? I didn't have this study 30 years ago. It would have come in handy. But we continue. Here's another test of game theory. And this one actually will also go with the title that was handed out about how clever you are. I remember we played this game. The first time I heard about this game was at that summer camp that Ernst went to. And so here's the way this game works. You all have to guess a number from 0 to 100. And the object is to make your guess as close as possible to 2/3 of the average guess of all of you that are guessing. Okay? Now you might think about what you would guess. So to be clear, suppose there are 3 players. They guess 25, 50, and 75. The average is 50. 2/3 of that is 33, so the person that guessed 25 would win. Okay? Everybody understand? Now, how might people think about playing this game? Before I get to that, I'll tell you I've actually had the chance to run this game in the Financial Times twice. The first time with a prize of 2 business class tickets to North America. The second time was a few months ago, and the Financial Times seems to have gotten cheaper, and it was the prize was a very posh travel bag. But FT readers are a smart lot, so you might think about what you'd guess. Okay, so how might people think about this? Well, they might say, well, you know, FT readers really aren't all that bright, and they'll just pick a number at random. If people pick a number at random, the average will be 50, so I should guess 33. Well, there could people one step ahead of them would say, well, most of these people are not very bright. They'll guess at random. The average will be 50, so I should guess 2/3 of that, or 33. But then, of course, we get to level 2. Most of these people will figure out how the game works. They'll think that people will guess 33, so I should guess 2/3 of that, or 22. And you can see there's no particularly convenient place to get off this train of thinking. Now, for the economics students in the room, the quiz question that will be worth 5 points in class tomorrow is, what's the Nash equilibrium in this game? And the correct answer is 0. The Nash equilibrium is the only number that if everyone guessed it, no one would want to change their guess. And you can see if everyone guesses 3, you'd want to guess 2. If everyone guesses 2, you'd want to guess 1.3, and 0. Okay, now, so economic theory has a prediction. Everyone will guess 0. Right? Because they're all smart, and they know everyone else is smart, and they know everyone else thinks everyone else is smart, so they'll all guess 0. How do the FT readers do in this game? So here's the contest I ran this summer. The winning guess was 12. When we played 17 years ago, the winning guess was 13. The distribution was virtually identical. I got to play this game. I'm not sure. There's a little glitch with the slides. That's my fault. We then played this game at the New York Times. I won't show you the distribution of answers. It looks a bit the same. The average guess was higher. But they did something interesting, which is they calculated how long it took for somebody to make their guess. So this was done online, and This isn't very precise, but they had a clock running. And here's the plot. So we have time thinking on the vertical axis and the guess. So what do we see here? These people that are guessing very stupid numbers are not thinking very hard, right? Somebody guesses 80, isn't going to win, but they guess very quickly. Now, here's the interesting thing. You see these humps? This is 33, this is 22. The guy's thinking about the Nash equilibrium. So what Danny Kahneman calls system 2 takes longer, right? That's why his book was called Thinking Fast and Slow. So the fast answer is wrong. So anyway, you can see there's a lesson here, which is you can get newspapers to run your experiments for you. Now, what about markets? If you read my book, you'll see it's mostly a bunch of stories. So let me tell you a story. The story takes place, I think, in 1986 at the University of Rochester. And at my dinner table was Amos Tversky, who I mentioned earlier, Kahneman's famous co-author, possibly the smartest man I've ever met. And Michael Jensen, a University of Chicago PhD, and at that time, a very strong defender of efficient markets. So Amos decides to have a little fun, and he starts asking Jensen to talk about the economic decision-making of his wife, he tells us stories, and then his students, members of Congress, and this took about half an hour, and for each one, Jensen had a very long list of stupid things that these people did with money. Then Amos asked him the following question, look, I don't understand this. Somehow everybody you know is an idiot, but everybody in your models are geniuses. What gives? So Jensen said, Amos, you just don't understand. Now, there was very little Amos didn't understand. So what is it that Amos allegedly didn't understand? He didn't understand something that I now call the invisible hand wave. So let me tell you what the invisible hand wave is. And this is some version of what Jensen said. If people behaved in markets the way they do in your dumb experiments, then, and now it's my claim that no one has been able to finish that sentence keeping both hands still. It's not possible to do. You have to do a lot of hand waving, right? Because, I mean, what's supposed to happen? Now, let's go back and look at what Adam Smith said about the invisible hand. First of all, the phrase appears once in the gigantic book, The Wealth of Nations, and here's what he said. He says, a business owner is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention, nor is it always the worst for society. Notice that phrase, nor is it always the worst for society. That's weak, right? This is the basis of an entire ideology of laissez-faire economics, nor is it always the worst for society. So same for people. What is it, this invisible hand wave argument about people? What's supposed to happen in markets? Suppose that somebody chooses the wrong career. Suppose Ernst should have been a movie star. You know, he blew it. He could have been Clooney. You know, instead, you know, he's just an economics professor. You know, now, you know, I met him young enough. I could have told him, you know, Ernst, really, acting is your calling. But you know, what happens? Nothing, you know. So most decisions we make, if somebody fails to save for retirement, they don't die. They just have a kind of unhappy retirement. If you take out a mortgage that you won't be able to pay, you'll get foreclosed upon, right? And maybe you'll learn your lesson, maybe you won't. But here's the key point. Markets don't work in that magic way. And the reason is that it's much easier to make money taking advantage of somebody's biases than it is correcting them. Here's an example. In the US, last year we sold $27 billion of extended warranties. Now, here's a bit of economic advice. Never buy an extended warranty. If they're making money selling it to you, and probably the guy at the counter is taking half the fee as a commission, but you just don't want to do that, right? Trip insurance, another good thing to skip. Now, you know, for years I've been telling people not to buy extended warranties. So far I haven't made a cent from that advice, right? Lots of people are making billions selling that insurance. I'm not making anything selling the advice not to buy that insurance. And that's the basic point. You can't make money correcting biases. It's a lot easier to make money exploiting them. So what about the biggest stakes of all, the financial markets? My colleague Gene Fama coined the phrase the efficient market hypothesis. And it has two components. I like to call them the no free lunch component and the price is right component. The no free lunch says you can't beat the market. The price is right says asset prices are equal to intrinsic value. So what do I think about those two hypotheses? The no free lunch component I give like B plus A minus. It's mostly true. Most active managers fail. Some succeed. Maybe you can beat the market. Full disclosure, I'm a principal in an active management company that is still in business after 20 years. So we claim we can beat the market by a little most of the time, but maybe we're just lucky. So this, you know, I don't have any big qualms with that, and certainly the advice to put your money in index funds is perfectly sound. In fact, I think you should only invest in index funds or funds we manage. Now, what about the Price is Right component? For a long time, financial economists lived in the comfort of thinking this hypothesis was untestable. And there's nothing better about a hypothesis than being untestable. It really makes you sleep well at night. But it turns out, and why? Well, you know, suppose somebody says Apple is overvalued. Somebody else says it's cheap. Who can know, right? But in some cases, we can say for sure. Let me give you an example. There's a fund, it's called a closed-end mutual fund, that invests in the Caribbean. And it happens to have the ticker symbol CUBA. Now, it has never invested in Cuba. First of all, it would be against the law. Second of all, there are no securities. So, two pretty big obstacles to investing in Cuba. For years, this fund traded at about a 15% discount to the value of the assets it owned. Now, this fact that these closed-end funds tend to trade at prices that are different from the assets they own is, in and of itself, an embarrassment to the efficient market hypothesis. I've written a paper about these funds, but it's not as bad as what I'm going to show you. You can guess on this chart which was the day that President Obama announced that he was going to relax relations with Cuba. On that day, the fund went from a 15% discount to a 70% premium. And I just updated this chart yesterday. It's still selling for a 15% premium. Now, if somebody has a rational explanation for that, come talk to me afterwards or raise your hand in the Q&A. I can't think of one. And, you know, so we've raised the stakes now as high as we can get them. So, you know, what have we seen in the last 30 years? We saw in October 1987, stock prices fell 20 to 30% all around the world, trillions of dollars lost on a day with no news. The only news was stock prices were falling all around the world. And the rest of that week was a bit like the week we had a couple weeks ago, but worse. Then we had the tech bubble of the 1990s, the real estate bubble of the early 2000s. I don't have China on here. But there have been a lot of bubbles, and they burst. Fisher-Black, the inventor of the Black-Scholes formula, defined an efficient market as one that prices are right within a factor of 2. I think if he had lived long enough, I could have convinced him to raise that to 3. But that's not a really efficient market, is it? You know, if I tell you that the Dow Jones Industrials is at 30,000 and it should be within 15 or 50,000, right? I mean, that's not very precise. So, where are we headed? What I hope we're headed for is what I cheekily call evidence-based economics. And you might ask a question kind of like Herb Simon's question. What other kind of economics could there be? And the answer is, well, economic theory is based on fictional creatures. Might as well have a theory of unicorns. There are no econs. So if we have theories that are based on fiction, we don't have evidence-based theory. So it's time for new theories based on the behavior of humans. And there are some examples of those theories. I've listed some here. There are many others I could add. So this is developing, but these are theories that start with data and then generate theories, rather than start with axioms of what rational, selfish people would do, and then derive predictions. It's also time for policies that are not based on the assumption that everybody is rational, has perfect self-control, and that bubbles are theoretically impossible. Alan Greenspan admitted after the fact that he had made a mistake in thinking that a financial crisis like the one we observed couldn't happen. Okay. I'm going to be very brief about this and then finish, because we want to have Q&A. Nudging, my previous book, was about designing policies for humans. And here's an example, GPS. GPS, you have it on your phone, you probably have it in your car. There's no rule saying you have to use it, and no rule saying you have to listen to her advice, right? But if you use it, you get lost less often. Nudges are just like GPS. They're ways to improve people's decision-making, help them get where they want to go, and get lost less often. So how do we do it? I've been working with the nudge unit in the UK that David Cameron formed in 2010, the Behavioral Insight team. And when I would work with them and go around talking to ministers about how we could help them, I had two mantras. One, make it easy. If you want to help people do something, make it easy. And the second, we can't do evidence-based policy without evidence. These two seem like the most obvious, banal things you've ever heard, but we accomplished a lot basically on those two principles. You can read a lot about the progress of these. The Behavioral Insight team in London released a report on 2 years of progress a few weeks ago. The White House issued a report yesterday, and President Obama announced that the new unit there would become a permanent part of the White House. So I think I'm going to stop talking about. I'm going to say I'm going to skip this slide. My wife hates when I do this. I'm going to skip a bunch of slides. I'm going to just go to this slide. What are my ambitions for nudging? My ambitions are that we get behavioral scientists, meaning behavioral economists and psychologists and sociologists and everybody, to think about bigger problems. So I had some slides in there about how we've collected tax money and got people to save for retirement. Here are some big stories that we can tell. And I'm going to tell you one story that comes from my wife. She was riding in a tuk-tuk in some country, I won't mention which one, and the driver gets pulled over by the police, and he gets out to talk to the policeman, and then comes back, and she says, "What happened? Did you do anything wrong?" No. 200 rupees. Oh well. She said, "No, that's terrible. You didn't do anything wrong. Why should you pay 200 rupees? And he said, "What? No. You know how much it cost that guy to get that job?" Now, that really is not a story about India. It's a story about many many parts of the world, where the biggest problem is corruption. And we can talk about other things like tax compliance, climate change, terrorism. These are the big issues of the day. I could list more, like health problems. All of these are behavioral problems. And how are we going to address them? Only by understanding behavior and by eliciting trust. And I don't know how to do that, but if I live long enough, I hope to find out. So let me end with that.
Wide up? You're wide up. So,
Yes.
ladies and gentlemen, we now move to the concluding part of the evening. Just very quickly, my name's Haig Simonian. One or two of you may remember I was here for many years as the correspondent of the Financial Times. You've heard about the paper. See why I left. It's going downhill, only giving travel bags out. I'm now a freelance journalist and writer and do quite a lot of conference work. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's an honor to have the chance to talk to you. We need to keep an eye on the time, and we would like to have the opportunity to take questions from a very considerable audience, so I'll keep my bit as short as possible. Very, very briefly, you got a view of the author just in the remarks. He didn't ask me to do a pitch for the book, but I'm doing it. It's a great read. I haven't read an economic books in many, many, many years. In English, you'd possibly call it a romp, but it's not pejoratively intended. It's positively intended as a compliment. It is a romp through economics of the last 30 or 40 years. It is entertaining, hence I call it a romp, but it's also well-founded because it's extremely insightful and extremely thought-provoking. I can only recommend it very highly. You got a taster for it in the last 45 minutes of talk. Thank you very much.
I'll pay later for that.
I'll remember. You heard him. I have witnesses. I'd like to just talk a little bit about one or two of the things that we heard, especially the big picture policy side rather than the more microeconomic side that's all in the book and you can see for yourselves. And then, if there's time, I'd like to talk a tiny bit about Switzerland, and we also want to talk take some questions, so I better speak fast. Two things I wanted to ask you, though, going to your concluding remarks. Your previous book with Cass Sumstein, Nudge, was about behavioral economics, but how it can be used in practical policy contexts. And you referred to the British government and others that have taken that advice on board. And that's really where I'd like to start. In the NZZ interview that Carolina Muller-Merl referred to, I believe you told the journalists that according to the most recent World Bank data you'd seen, there are about 50 countries now which have set up units, departments, agencies along those lines. Are you flattered? Are you positively surprised? Or are you cross that more haven't actually gone that way?
No, I mean, we're shocked. When, you know, nobody wanted to publish this book, just like my old papers. It was the same thing. And we published it with a sleepy university press and hoped that some of our friends might read it. Of course, one of Cass's friends was a senator from Illinois. We hoped he might read it. But no, we never dreamed that this would happen. There were 800-900 people at a conference in London that I was at a couple of weeks ago. Ernst's brother was there and can attest to that. And the World Bank is interested in this, and Yeah, so it's shocking and gratifying, and the fact that the president made this unit permanent yesterday was, I wish I could have been there.
Well timed for today's lecture. You end the book on a positive note, an optimistic note, as you ended your remarks on a positive note on the view that that behavioral economics had already had a significant influence on the field, but there were still diehards to convince and still some way to go. You mentioned very clearly in the book, though, that one of the things that surprised you was that behavioral economics had made big progress in microeconomics. You were very surprised at its dominance even in financial economics, but you were surprised that the big picture macro stuff had been less affected than you might have originally expected. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, so the biggest surprise was the success in finance. And the reason was, everyone thought, including me, that financial markets were the most efficient markets in the world and the least likely places to find misbehaving. But then it turned out all you had to do was look, as we saw with the Cuba Fund. And there are dozens of these. Now, why was behavioral finance such a success? It had a combination of two things. One, great data. We have daily stock price data going back to 1926. The other is tightly specified hypotheses. So that Cuba slide, that is misbehaving. No one can possibly disagree with that. Macro, has a shortage of data. Now that sounds like a funny thing to say. There's data announced every day. The problem is that recessions only come every few years. We need more. More recessions, more financial crises. And, we really need countries to allow us, I think there are some people in Parliament here, we need countries to allow us to do randomized control trials on how to deal with crises, right? So we want one country to tighten, one to loosen, and then right? So
isn't European politics going that way at the moment?
Well, it could be, but the damn EU, So, in all seriousness, it's very hard to prove anybody wrong. Like my comment about what the Federal Reserve should do. I think you and I disagree about that. So, and we're very reasonable people. So macro has been hard to get through, and in fact, the dominant way of thinking in macro is to think that everyone would guess zero in that guess the number game. Rational expectations is still the dominant approach, and it's a ridiculous idea. It's just completely ridiculous. But I'm hoping that people will take up behavioral macro seriously.
So there's still grounds.
Oh yeah, it can be done, and we've created all these brilliant young scholars, and somebody will do it, I'm sure.
I'll turn to Switzerland for a couple of questions, and I'll ask our audience to ask you further. In the book, when you move on to nudge and how behavioral economics can influence policymaking, you coined the phrase, or new to me, liberal paternalism. And that rung a bell with me. It seemed extremely reasonable, extremely sensible, how you can use psychological insights and the data and the economic knowledge that you've garnered to try and steer people in a certain direction, but in a direction that you believe is not compulsory, but is in a broad way that benefits society as a whole. I haven't done it very well, but I've tried to encapsulate it. And I thought about this in the Swiss concept. And I thought to myself, liberal, well, that's a real Swiss word. I mean, the oldest party here was the Free Democratic Party, the liberals or the radicals, they go under various names. Liberalism is a strong and ongoing Swiss tradition in political and economic thought. And therefore that chimes very well with Switzerland. The paternalism bit I wasn't quite so sure about. And I asked myself, because are there two possible areas of conflict here? One on a purely organizational aspect, namely that nudging, it seemed to me at least, involved some degree of central coordination. You had to aggregate information, you had to draw big picture conclusions and steer from the top. And that really goes against the Swiss tradition of extreme devolution in politics and in economics. And secondly, also in terms of political philosophy, it seemed to me somewhat against the Swiss tradition in the sense that Switzerland tradition is very much one of emphasizing the individual and the individual's right to understand, to decide for him and or herself. Okay, we're not quite with Ron Paul yet in extreme libertarianism, but there is that strong strand in Swiss history. And I just wondered how, sorry, I've made it too long, you think your views, liberal paternalism, fits in with the Swiss model?
Well, I don't see any conflict. So, we call it libertarian paternalism, liberal paternalism. The adjective, the first word, is extremely important to us. And, the UK government recently launched a national pension scheme that very controversially utilized a behavioral economic concept called automatic enrollment. This was devised years ago, before Nudge, and people said, nobody's going to join, maybe at best you'll get 50%. So far, less than 10% are opting out. So, look, many countries have mandatory saving plans. Australia has a similar plan, but it's mandatory. This is freedom, and 90% are joining. That's pretty good. And, much of what the report released by the White House unit was about was just making things simpler. It turns out in the U.S., to go to college, if you need a loan, the form you have to fill out is horrendous. And the data you need is tax data. Now, who has the tax data? The government. How about having the government fill the form out for you? Not a bad idea, right? So, what's making things simpler, making data available, like the GPS analogy is my best one. Nobody has to use it, but they get lost less often if they do.
I'll do a last Swiss question and then open it up. I mean, there are a million things we could talk about. Switzerland has got elections in exactly a month's time, and you know from your own country where presidential elections are a little bit further away, but the temperature's already heating up significantly, that there's some very big issues. Immigration, education, just to think of two. But let me pick something else, Swiss. One of our sponsors alongside the University of Zurich's economics department tonight is the Müller-Moell Foundation. And there's a bit of a controversy at the moment in Switzerland with foundations as to the role of foundations. You'd think foundations are a good thing. They invited you to come tonight. They invited me to moderate. That makes them pretty good as far as I'm concerned.
Brilliant, yeah.
But there are those who would suggest, and perhaps this has got to do with extreme Swiss egalitarianism, there are those who suggest that actually that's not the right way to proceed because foundations shouldn't be there deciding things for us, making policy decisions on our behalf, that somehow we should all be involved. Is that in any way realistic as far as you're concerned?
I must say I have trouble getting that. And that's not just because my host is sitting in front of me. Look, I suppose it depends what the foundation does. So if the foundation is setting policies and telling me what to do, then I'm not going to like it. I don't like people telling me what to do. If the foundation is enabling, then that's great. Let me just give one example from education. there's a study by a young economist at Harvard called Roland Fryer. There have been hundreds of experiments done with doing kind of economic interventions in schools, paying teachers, paying students, paying parents, all the various combinations of that. Basically, none of them work, except one. The one that worked was paying students to get better grades, useless. Paying students to do their homework works. So here's my interpretation of that. And in economics terms, I would say the students don't know the production function. So what do I mean by that? My father used to offer me $100 if I would get straight A's. I never got it. Never once. I wanted 100, but right now, but you know, maybe if he had said each night, I'll give you $1 if you show me your homework done, maybe I would have gotten better grades. So there have been other experiments. Texting parents the night before kids have a big exam improves grades. So parents don't have to give their phone number. They don't have to take the text message. Nobody has to do anything. If they want their kids to do better, presumably the parents who get the text message say, you know, hey, Joe, what about that test you have tomorrow? Turn off the video game.
So libertarian paternalism.
This is actual paternalism by parents.
Paternalism.
Yes.
All right, let's open the floor to questions. Just two things. We have really very little time. I'm told we have to stop at 8. If I get a big signal from someone, we'll run on a tiny bit, but I think we should probably look at 8 o'clock, which gives us not very long. Secondly, please, questions, not statements, because we haven't got an awful lot of time. 2 people with microphones. I got my reading glasses, but not my distance ones. Will you help me with the back rows in case I miss anybody?
We've got somebody right over here.
Let's start.
Hello, my name is Dirk Albing. So you questioned the efficiency of stock markets, and my question is, what is the alternative? You know, would you replace free financial markets by something else, and how would this institution look like? Question 2, or maybe a comment. Our society.
Let's skip the comment.
Let's have one question if you don't mind, because there are a lot of people.
The answer is no. We've got nothing better. So we don't want to replace financial markets with something else. What we want to do is have policymakers who are alert to the possibility that prices are wrong. Now, what steps they should take, that's a longer conversation. Let me give one tiny example. If I had been the chairman of the Fed in 2004 and 5, or the head of the lending agencies, I would have raised the lending requirements in the cities that had the most frothy markets. So instead of being able to get a loan with 5% down, 20% down. That's, if you ask me, that's what I would have done. But God knows I don't want the government running asset markets.
Thank you. Next question.
Microphone.
In the middle there?
Right here in the middle.
Yep. Thank you. This gentleman here.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
So a big part of your talk is about how we're humans rather than econs, and we can try to kind of do better policy by figuring out how to make us less, you know, how to help the humans. I see a lot of problems that come about because there are econs out there, like the person that set up the system that you have to pay to become the cop in whatever country that was, or the people selling product insurance.
Right.
So, I mean, to what extent is maybe a bigger problem in some of these things, including climate change, that the kind of the econs out there have the right model, and are doing a really good job of taking advantage of the humans.
Okay, so a really good question. And, you know, I get a lot of questions about the ethics of nudging. Who are you to set the default, blah, blah, blah? I'll tell you one quick story, because that's what I do. But I'll make it quick, I promise. When the first review of my book came out, it was published in a London newspaper, not the FT.
This is nudging, not misbehaving, we're talking about.
And this is misbehaving. Just a few months ago. My editor sends me an email with a link. I excitedly click on it, and I run into a paywall. And I'm invited to take a trial subscription for a month for £1. Mm-hmm. I read the fine print, and it turns out the 1 month subscription I can cancel, but I have to give 15 days notice. And I can't cancel online. I have to call London, not on a toll-free line, during London business hours. Okay? Now, I don't approve of that. Is it illegal? Probably not. Almost certainly not. Is it deceptive? Certainly yes. Is it smart business? We can talk about that after several bottles of wine, but I think not, but that remains to be seen. So somehow we need to monitor the predators, and that can be us being smarter consumers, it can be regulators, it could be shaming institutions. I plan to write an article about this practice in another newspaper. Whether I name that newspaper, I'll decide later.
We can misbehave and take one more, but we don't have to. And I'm sorry, because there are people in the two balconies too, although we can't get
a microphone and a hand.
All right, let's go there.
Close proximity.
Let's go there and close it with that one.
Thank you, Professor Thaler. Great enjoying your talk. My name is Hannes Krasiger. I'm interested in all things internet. And there's a lot of nudging happening, actually. You might remember the experiment where Facebook was experimenting with the mood of people. And I was thinking about, so my first question to you would be, do you think it would be possible to change voter outcome in swing states with that form of nudging? And if so, would you think nudging in the private sphere should be regulated?
Well, the answer to your question of whether nudging can influence the outcome of political elections is yes, and it did. And I'll tell you the secret, because it's not a secret anymore. When calls are made to voters on election day, the old script was, are you planning to support our candidate? If yes, thank you very much. We appreciate your support. New script. Are you planning to support our candidate? If yes, when? How are you going to get there? Do you need a ride? That script increases turnout by about 3 or 4%, much less than the margin in Ohio in 2008.
So easily enough to swing a swing state.
And did.
That young man from Ohio was quite smart, wasn't he? Ohio, I'm from Illinois, excuse me.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, I don't think I can better it. I'd love to take a dozen more questions, but I think we've run out of time. Ernst, I think it's for you to say some closing words.
I will make some closing remarks, and I have a gift here for Dick and Francis. So, as many of you know, we regularly have these events once or twice a year, and look at our webpage, econ.uzh.ch or econ.uzh.ch to get informed about these events. and now I close. We have a little gift for you. One is a book with nice pictures about Switzerland. So we thought you might like that, or Francis. And then, of course, being in Switzerland, it's impossible not to give you chocolate.
Oh.
So because we want to induce some misbehavior. Give you chocolate. Thank you very much for this night.
Thank you. Thank you.